Children's Lit Task 4, Chapter 5 in the textbook, Modern Fantasy. The main thesis for this chapter in the textbook is talking about fantasy stories related to today's learner or child. The book starts off by saying that some educators and parents question the value of fantasy for today's child. They argue that children want contemporary stories and not so much fantasy stories in their learning. That means that parents want students to learn more about real-world situations than flying dragons and vast forests. The book states that parents are afraid that reading about goblins and trolls and witches will lead children to practices of Satanism. I actually see that firsthand quite often. I once had a friend in 6th grade who wouldn't come see the movie Harry Potter with me because he said that we would be worshiping the devil. We were 6th graders, and he eventually admitted that he just didn't want to go to the movies with me at that time, but it's a real concern for some people. I believe, like the book, that fantasy is important for learners. Fantasy enables learners, and people of all ages really, to use their imagination. I personally believe that using your imagination is so important in life. There are many different types of fantasy stories. The book talks about several types. The first type of fantasy stories are literary fairy tales. These are the tales that are passed down from generation to generation and don't really have an author. These would be the fairy tale stories like Humpty Dumpty, Jack and Jill, and basically any character that is in the Shrek franchise. The next type of fantasy stories are animal fantasies. The book gives the example of Charlotte's Web. This is obviously a fantasy that deals with animals. In these fantasies, animals can talk, and there have been many movie adaptations of these fantasies. The next type is eccentric characters and preposterous situations. There are several good examples of these. The first one given in the book is Pippi Longstocking. This is about an orphan who lives alone with her monkey and her horse in a child's utopia where she tells herself when to go to bed and when to get up. She's basically her own ruler, and she is someone not to mess with. Another one is Mr. Popper's Penguins, which became a movie recently where Jim Carrey portrayed the title character. Jim Carrey is a very eccentric human being. Finally, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, which is all about Willy Wonka, who's a very silly and over-the-top owner of a candy company. The next type of fantasy story is extraordinary worlds. The best example for this is Alice in Wonderland. Alice finds a white rabbit and follows him into the rabbit hole. This sends her to a world that was never seen before, with crazy jungles, interesting characters, and amazing situations. Another extraordinary world scenario is that of Harry Potter. This is a world that's full of castles, dragons, and underground tombs where wizards keep their money and gold. The next type is suspense and supernatural. A lot of these stories I don't have much experience with, but a few examples given are The House with Clock in Its Walls and Coraline. Coraline seemed to me to be a dark story filled with thrills and nightmarish and cartoonish scenes. There is also high fantasy. High fantasy is the type of fantasy like the book The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. This is a book that seems to be like high adventure. There are many characters and almost on like an epic scale. These stories also usually draw a line between good and evil. The good in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is, of course, the lion. There is also science fiction fantasy. A good example of science fiction fantasy is The Giver. In The Giver, there are images of a future world. In this world, pollution is gone, family life is simple, and communities are orderly and peaceful. This story seems both very real and very laden with fantasy all at once. It is almost like a dystopian future, except everything seems normal and great on the outside. Some other types of fantasy stories that I talked about but have their own section in the book are magical powers, time shift fantasies, and imaginary realms. Evaluating the modern fantasy. Well-written fantasies have great plots, convincing characters, a theme, and an appropriate style. A prime concern that the book says that fantasy stories have are the way that the author makes the fantasy believable. There are a few ways that the author makes fantasies believable. First, they can create belief by careful attention to the detail of the setting. The way that the setting is portrayed to the reader makes it more believable. You can have these great fantasy worlds, but as long as it makes sense to the reader, it'll work. Another way is to have one of the major characters have disbelief of the world they're in as well. A third way is to use appropriate language of the fantasy. The book says that in the story The Foxbusters, there are many puns for the language in the story. For example, chickens speak Hennish while foxes speak Vulpine. Another way to make the fantasy believable is to have real objects give another dimension to the truth in the books. Each fantasy story has to have a logical framework and it must be consistent. Also, all plots must be original. Children obviously have always loved fantasies. Like I've went over, some fantasies are completely out there, while other ones have bits of reality in them. It is often these fantasies that are like nursery rhymes, fairy tales, and folk tales that first have children starting to use their creativity at a young age. The question of how appropriate fantasy stories are for children and young learners is not a new question. An educator must be able to deal with a parent's objection to a particular book. The book asks, should teachers as professionals be free to exercise their judgment in the selection of children's literature to read in a classroom? That is an interesting question. I personally believe that some stories are not appropriate for kids, but I do believe that imagination is essential to young learners. In the end, the book basically states that educators need to be aware of the boundaries that they are allowed to cross within their district. That makes a lot of sense to me. Anytime a teacher has a controversial moment, take that moment as a teachable moment. Teachers must always do what's best for their students. And if parents have issues with certain books that you're going to cover during a certain year, you have to be able to deal with their concerns. In the end, I really enjoyed this chapter, and I enjoyed making this video on it.